great honor and a pleasure to welcome Katherena Vermette again for this second day of our conference on narratives of vindication here at the University of Salamanca. Thank you, Katherena, for this second chance to enjoy your work, to enjoy your poetry. Today, Katherena is giving a reading of her poetry, a selection of poems from different books. She has titled this session as Poetry as Life Story, Make Beautiful. So without further ado, I think that we all know you by now, but if you wish to introduce yourself again, you're very welcome, and the floor is yours. Thanks again.
Haha, now you can hear me. Yay. Buenos dias. I am absolutely honored to be here. Oh, that's a good mic. And I always say I never do keynotes. I hate keynotes. There's so much pressure to be smart, and I don't want, and say something really profound. So I don't do the keynote. So this will not be a keynote. This is going to be a poetry reading. I'm trying to tie in, trying to make meaning of all of my poetry, but that's where I'm most comfortable. It's also, I think, something like 3 o'clock in the morning for me, so I don't know how articulate I'm going to be. I'm going to try my best, which is why I'm relying on the things I've already written that I know make sense. I want to start by introducing myself. I did it yesterday, but I want to introduce myself traditionally because, one, I feel very conscious of where I am right now. I'm delighted to be here in this gorgeous city, in this historic institution. I'm also very conscious of all the Christopher Columbus stuff that you have hanging around, which is, I don't know what you know of the, well, I'm sure you know some of it, but the history of my people, the collective indigenous nations of North America. You know, Christopher Columbus is kind of a different sort of figure for us than he is for other parts of the world. So it's important for me to bring my language, my traditional languages here. It's also, I do this introduction as a way to ground myself and remember what's important as I do this kind of work. So Buju, Anin, Tanse, Chiguana Koduk Nadishnakas, Zongi Gabowik Mede Nadishnakas, Megisi Dodam, Winnipeg, Rivière Rouge, Nedunjaba, Nedinawe Maganuk, Marci, Chimigwech. Thank you. Gracias. And with that, I just introduced by my names, my traditional names. I carry 2 names that roughly translate to out of the clouds is one of them, appearing from behind the darkness. Anishinaabe Moan is a very wide-ranging language that requires a lot of verbs, so to translate them is very difficult. So my one name translates to something like out of the clouds or out of the darkness, which I think is kind of profound as someone who's always kind of been in the clouds and in the depression, so that was a cool name. And my other name means, stands with strength. My clan is Eagle Clan. Eagle Clan are apparently the visionaries, though I don't take that too seriously. The dreamers. Literally in the clouds. It's all about clouds for me. And the other thing I said there was Nedinawe Maganuk, which means all my relations. So it means that I carry all my relations with me here. And they're beating up the ghosts of Christopher Columbus, and I'm going to read some poetry. So I've written 3 books of poetry now. My first book I wrote about in 2012, so it was when it was published, the North End Love Songs. My second is River Woman, and my third is just in the finishing stages. It's called Procession. And in doing this, when you get to that point of three, three is, as we know, the three-act structure, this three-act narrative. It feels like this whole big story. So I'm thinking of it as this whole big story. My poetry, as I was talking yesterday, really feels a little bit like my own story. And whenever we tell our own story, I always think it's important to think about why we're telling it. Because as much as our stories might be interesting to us as we gossip amongst ourselves, it's always interesting to me to think of why we tell our life story, why we do that articulation and bring it forward in the world, why it's important to do that and the action of that. So in the sense, I'm thinking of when I'm thinking about this and preparing this talk, I was thinking of the themes of this validation, this genealogies of power. So maybe in a sense, I feel like this is kind of the genealogy of myself. So I always wanted to write, picture it, precocious 10-year-old girl, very, very frizzy hair. Before I learned this is actually a very tamed version of what my hair is supposed to be. The discovery of product sometime in my teen years was very monumental for me. I always wanted to write. I always wanted to hole myself up in a little broom, like all those poets and writers do, and I just wanted to make beautiful things. When I started writing, it was, as a teenager, it was all journaling, as we do as teenagers, right? I always said something along the lines of, I never knew what I was thinking and feeling until I wrote it and then read it back to myself. I've learned now that that's actually called disassociation, and it's not good, but it's a trauma response apparently. But it was something that really got me through some of the hardest times of my life. But when I started publishing, I didn't want to write about myself. I fought very hard to write about myself. I didn't think I was important. I didn't think I was interesting. I wanted to write about everyone out in the world. When I was gathering the work for my first book, I wanted to write what I called, very precociously, very self-righteously, observational poetry, right? I wanted to make a character study of my neighborhood and this place I come from. I was enamored with the people and the personalities I was surrounded by, and I didn't want to write about myself in any way. I wanted to write about them. My friend and mentor, Duncan McCready, told me that when we write, we're supposed to introduce ourselves, as I did at the beginning of this, by telling where we come from. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to talk about where I come from. And I tried very hard not to write about myself. So I'll read this first poem, which is called Selkirk Avenue. And this was my attempt to not write about myself. And to explain this poem briefly, all the poems in this section of the book take on all the observational poetry I was writing. Was all these other characters, and I made them into birds because I liked birds. That's a good enough reason, right? Selkirk Avenue, look at thrush. Girl walks up Selkirk Avenue, head down, body huddled into herself. Shakes with winter, squeezes her arms around an oversized gray sweater, as if she could hide and not feel the cold. 2, Robin. Girl stands on Selkirk Avenue, head down, her body cries like a baby alone. Paces around circle, way too young body squeezed into way too tight clothing. She breathes out with her whole chest puffed out bright and red, as if she's beautiful, as if she's proud. 3, hummingbird. Girl drives down Selkirk Avenue, looks forward, as if she don't look at all of them, they won't be there. Doors locked, too loud music drowns the voices outside, like her windows are only TV screens, and all the other girls on the street are only a show. So maybe not surprisingly, I did very much get myself in there, whether I wanted to or not. I did a really interesting thing when I wrote this collection. I write a lot in the I, the first person when I start writing. And when I went through this this poetry collection, part of my method of distancing myself, hiding myself, if you will, was I changed all the I's to she's. And in that, it made all of the poems that I was writing about other people and all the poems I was writing about myself indistinguishable. We became the same person, the same character. And I loved that. Because then I could really get going and I could really hide. And I wasn't talking about myself. I was talking about this other character. And then I found I really got into that groove of what they call finding your voice. I don't know if we have budding writers in the room. I'm sure we do. No, really? I'm always talking to poets. Only poets are interested in poetry. But when you start writing, everyone inevitably always says, "Oh, you just have to find your voice. You just have to." It's a pat on the head of a comment, right? "Oh, you're almost there. Here you go." And I was sitting there screaming, "I have a voice. I'm using it. I'm using it to talk to you." But what they were talking about was finding what you wanted to write about, finding your way through. And I loved talking about my home. I loved talking about this place I found completely uninterested and completely normal and boring and almost shameful. But when I come to a place like this, I realize the contrast of exactly how different my life is from other folks' lives. And all of our lives are like that, depending on where we go in the world. And again, it comes back to that idea of writing from my home. And like I said, our home, where we come from. To know where I come from is to know who I am. And again, that's true for all of us. To know where it's literally from the water we drink and the food we eat makes up our bodies, but also it's the people we surround ourselves and the spirits that stay in the place that we come from. So this poem is called Wildflowers. And again, this is the miraculous she, because it is not me at all. It's the wildflowers she feels sorry for. They gotta watch their backs. Nobody wants them around. People spread poison to kill them off, call them weeds. She thinks it's a shame because if you let them just grow, they're really quite beautiful. Flowering pink and butter yellow can fill a dark space with a splendid green if you let them. But if they flower, they will seed. If you let them, they'll take over. They'll choke out all the poppies and marigolds, roses and daffodils. No planted flower stands a chance against a pack of weeds. So they get yanked, roots burned, concrete's thrown over them. Still, they sprout out all over the place, push through cracks in the sidewalk, congregate on otherwise respectable lawns. Darn squatters, she thinks. They're the ones who really gotta watch their backs. So I'm gonna skip a poem. I'm just telling my translator. I'm gonna skip a poem because I'm feeling pressed for time. Oh, I'm not gonna. I'm jet lagged, you guys. We got time. I'm gonna read the poem. It just requires a lot of preamble. To read this poem, I gotta explain the story. So part of the story and part of what I was dealing with as a teenager, part of where these poems come from, trying to articulate that experience, was my brother went missing. When I was 14 and he was 18, he was declared missing. later found to be deceased. It was after months of searching. And of course, this was the formidable point of my life, as so often trauma is that formidable point of your life. In the film I made, This River, which is available if you're interested in watching it, I articulate it as it was that point that I feel like everything came from. Because again, I was getting into that lovely spirit of trying to not think about it in terms of how it was affecting me. And of course it was affecting me, it still affects me. But also in that wider story of what that means, and that experience of having a loved one go missing, and the authorities and the police didn't take it seriously. He was a young man, he was a young Indigenous man in a city where young Indigenous men unfortunately go missing regularly. So it was one of those instances where I realized myself, I realized the world as it was, and I feel like anything I do that would remotely be called activism comes from that point of realization that I don't want anyone to go through what we went through. And unfortunately, too many people go through what we went through. The other thing I have to explain about this poem, which is called Mixtape, which I'll read next, is this took place in 1991. And 1991 was a beautiful time of hair metal and heavy metal. Are we on board here? Okay. We're talking about, I'm going to give reference to the wonderful balladeers of Skid Row, Guns N' Roses. Okay, we're good? We're on board? We've got some nods? Okay, so all of these, this is a mixtape, you guys. Mixtapes were those things, cassettes? Yes? Okay, we know. It's often an icon of some sort. I've seen them on stickers. We used to put them in machines and they played music. And they had a side A and a side B. So all of the song titles, all of the 18 in Life there, is a song title. Look them up on your Spotify, they're awesome. If you look up the singers and writers, they didn't all age well. I'm sorry, the 90s were hard on all of us, some of us more than others, and these were all like very white, male, there was a lot of misogyny happening. I don't think they're probably all canceled by now, but the songs are good. Except for Sebastian Bach. 18 in Life is a Skid Row song, if you don't know, and Sebastian Bach is actually singing opera now. Do we know this? I think it's amazing. He cut his hair, he looks awful. Don't smoke, kids. But he is singing opera, and I'm so happy for him. I just think that the trajectory of Sebastian Bach should be studied. He was also on Gilmore Girls. Yeah? Oh, we know that. You know, Sebastian Bach, we need a Sebastianus Renaissance. What is it? Sebastianisance. Yeah, Bacchusance. It's in there somewhere. It's going to be great. So this is, again, that story, The Miraculous She. It didn't happen to me at all. It's just a character. Mixtape, side A, 18 in Life. Her friend takes her to the guidance counselor. She doesn't see the point, but her friend won't go without her. 2, patience. The dining room stacked with papers, her brother's face on all of them like labels on cans of soup. 3, long cold winter. His football team organizes a search party. Scruffy boys in orange jerseys climb snowbanks along the river north, all the way to Lockport. 4, without you. She is as still as silence jolts every time the phone rings. 5, more than words. The family sliced into wedges like pie. 6, don't know what you got. The cold, wet when everyone else leaves. Side B. Sorry, that's when you take the cassette out and you have to flip it over. Unless you had one of those cool buttons that did the, but it never worked and it always jammed, and there's cassettes still in cars to this day. 7, nothing else matters. The family goes to 2 psychics and an elder. 8, every rose has its thorn. One says he will call soon, one says he is dead, one said he is traveling north. 9, what you give. Words evaporate, condense in the air, drip down walls. 10, don't cry. Her stepfather tells everyone his son is dead and he isn't gonna look anymore. 11, home sweet home. Her mother moves wide and slow, almost imperceptible, limbs floating as if in water. 12, November rain. Girl walks under winter naked elms, such a cold November, a season warmer than her house. Now I want to listen to those songs. They're really good bangers. If I had to recommend, I would say Patience, number 1, Home Sweet Home. Tommy Lee, we know who Tommy Lee is, right? Yeah, at the concerts, you gotta know. He came out with the big white grand piano. It was a moment. Every time. Still is a moment, I'm sure, even though Vince Neil sounds like shit. But can we talk about hair metal bands now? No, just kidding. I should have warned you too. Lots of trigger warnings in my work, but in between, I have that awkward traumatic response of making joy and laughter in between. It's like, oh, we're gonna talk about dead people now, but then I'm gonna make a joke and we're gonna be fine. So my second book of poetry, River Woman, which is this beautiful thing. I just love art, and I am fortunate enough to be able to have artists, like sometimes we commission art, and sometimes I just find art in places and, beg artists to let me use their work. So this is this is actually, his name is David LaRue, and this is actually a landscape. There's a river here, and this is traditionally our land. The Michif land was in the old seigneurie system, which is a French system, and it was in lines like this. And when the British came, those nasty British, they decided they didn't like this system because it was French, and they literally cut up the land into squares. So if you go overhead, where I'm from, middle of Canada, you still see it. You still see this grid of squares, and it looks like the land is so tame, when really all of that land is supposed to be bush and marshes and whatnot. So it's this amazing visual. I love this, of what was, and also how we literally violate the world. I'm always struck by this total aside, when I come to Europe, because here the land always looks still the same, cut up into farmland, but it's these organic shapes. There's always roundedness. There's always people are, these jagged rock walls and bushes along the edges. It's not like that where I come from. It's just this violent grid. Here it looks like it's been doing that for, a good 1,000 years or so. Which is its own colonization, just longer, but it's striking to me. I don't know. That's a whole other thing. So I'm going to read a couple poems from River Woman, and these were the poems I wrote while I was making a documentary. So I did make the documentary about my experience with my brother went missing. But of course, I didn't want to talk just about that singular story, because of course I didn't want to talk about myself. but also because that story is so painfully, tragically common, I wanted to talk about how it was common, how it was prevalent, but also other experiences. So there's a beautiful organization in my city called Drag the Red, Red River being one of our famous river, famous to us. And they search the river day in, day out. They literally comb it and drag it with tools to find clues, and they've found countless clues that archaeologists and police look over. They found items of clothing. They've found hair. There's always hair around. They have found clues of people who are missing, but there's also a backlog because they found so many things. They don't quite know all the things that they have found. And I love that way we can, and in my community, we do this so well, how we can take these tragic pieces and create something so active and powerful. Like they're literally they're dealing with the problem. They're just taking up those grassroots initiatives are just people standing up and taking care of their world and their community. And I wanted to celebrate that as much as possible and show that. So this is the poem that the film is kind of what started it all. And it's called This River is a Woman. This river is a woman. She is bright and she is beautiful. She once carried every nation here, but she is one of those women, too soon forgotten and broken like a body that begs without words, only rough hands that reach out, palms up. This river is a woman and she has been dragged and dragged. Metal coils catch her tangled hair and everyone wants to know her secrets, but she keeps them. She won't let them go unless she trusts you, unless you ask real nice, unless she feels like it. This river is a woman and she is full of good intentions, bad regrets, and sometimes she just folds into herself, can slow to a slush, then rush into race, currents indiscernible, patterns intangible, and below she goes even faster. This river is a woman forever returning, twisting north, a snake carved into prairie grass, hiding everywhere, eroded with age etched into her edges, and newly born every day. This river is your lover. She curls around you, pulses and fills you like heartbeat, and if you are very quiet, all you hear is her. This river is your mother. She flows on and unnoticed, slips in and slides out, as if she was never here, as if she was always here. This river is my sister. She is bright and beautiful and brown, sings soft every summer, holds us up all winter, and every spring she swells, reminds us we are just visitors here. This is her country. She is that woman. Her deft voice reaches out, broken by everything that has been thrown into her, but somehow her spirit rages on. Somehow a song like her never fades. So it is at this point I'm kind of realizing in my life that I'm not escaping my story. As much as I wanted to talk about everyone else and always pushing the attention that way, I think that's why I started writing novels, because novels were so deliberately fictitious and someone else, happening to someone else. But even still, as I was writing, then my novels are not about me. They are not my story in any way. But every writer sneaks into their story in some way or another, just simply by our worldview and where we come from and how we see the world, tells everyone what they need to know about us. And there's no escaping that. That's the job. It's not being holed up into a room by yourself. It is that too sometimes. But for the most part, it's really standing up in front of people and being really vulnerable with, this is who I am, this is where I come, and I might not want you to look at me, but it's all me. Which is hard to even say, because honestly, it's like, stop looking at me. As you're all looking at me. Actually, it's really fun when you have the words out, and I hope they're helpful, because I'm trying not to, usually I read poetry very fast. I'm trying to read it not so fast. But it's so funny, because as soon as the words come out, just like as soon as, if everyone has their book, it becomes reading time. And your eyes will go right to the words right away, and we follow along. And you can see exactly where I screw up, too. It's great. So I'm going to read Where, which is the next poem. And this was in the process of making the documentary. This was a lot of downtime in film. Whenever you work in film, it's about 5 minutes of excitement and 3 hours of just sitting around and waiting for that shot. So it's actually perfect for poetry writing. So I was processing my feelings in real time as I was disassociating, as I tend to do. Where? Not up in the groomed grass of the pretty park, not in the hilly bush high with growth and garbage, not kneeling on those polished pews, not even where the upright stones bruise the earth, not at the street where the fake flowers faded long ago, or where wounds open and cry out every night, not on the bridge where some went, or the old wood dock where others were taken, but here, near this last bend in the river, here where the trees break off and their leaves dance high with song, here where the water licks the sky like smoke, and the concrete is so old and smooth as rock. Here where the dock broke off and the edge is low, where the wind moves quick in and long out. There is still tobacco, there is still fire. Here with the river is where I will remember. So when doing that and kind of freeing myself from like, okay, I'm just going to talk about myself now, me time, I was able to start writing poems that were not about me. It became about, in yoga, just totally throwing in yoga there. I'm also a yoga teacher. That's a whole other life. In yoga and Buddhism, there is something called svadhyaya, which is self-study. And the whole premise in yogic philosophy and Buddhist philosophy is that if you have to know yourself. It is your job in this life to know yourself. And self-study and knowing what makes you tick, what makes you do that, actually, helps you be of service to the world. And of course I love this because this was the total excuse. It's like, okay, I'm only going to learn about myself so I can be of better service to the world. Again, always that passing off somewhere. But it's true. It's true. If you know your own self, you're able to have more empathy for others. And in that, you're able to look to the world with more compassion because you're looking at yourself with more compassion. So this next one is another story. It's in 2 parts. Oh, I'm totally out of time. I should have warned everyone. I'm jet-lagged. I'm going to go on and on. This country has another story, not one that is not his or hers or ours. It is written on the water, carved on earth, every stone a song that echoes the erosion. Hold one to your ear. Whispers rise. This country has another story, one that is not his or hers or even ours. It is scrolled on wind, painted in blood. Every bone sings. Hold them to your heart. Those buried voices still rise. And part 2, an other story. This country has another story, one that is not mine or yours, but ours. It is sung from the mountains, danced in the sky, every star a story that teaches. Hold your head up, wisdom descends. This country has another story, not just for you or me, but us. It is a prayer for you. It's a prayer I say to you. Every word burns hope, every silence only peace. Hold me tight. Close the distance between us. Keep me warm. So I feel the time. I'm going to read one more poem just to round it up and have it all make sense, in theory. And so this new book is called Procession, which I was thinking of in terms of the genealogy that I am a part of. There's an adage, a teaching in indigenous philosophy that basically the simplest is you're here to honor your ancestors and to prepare a place for your children. That's it. That's what we're here to do. So in that, it places us on this long line as only a piece of a larger whole. And I kind of love that because it really puts everything else into perspective. Like naming myself at the beginning, I am only these parts. I am this poet person, this writer person that gets to travel the world and be jet lagged. That's awesome. But I'm also only a granddaughter and hopefully one day a good ancestor. All of those things. So in this process of constantly trying to hide myself and finally admitting, okay, I'm going to focus on me. And the funny thing is, as I'm focusing on me, this new collection, I wanted it to just be straight memoir. I challenged myself, I'm going to finally write that memoir. And it's the furthest thing from that than anything else I've ever written, which is the irony of my life. Because it becomes about how this is only one small part of this larger whole. And that's what any life story ends up being in the end. Almost like we're this hinge between these things. So and that's kind of my lesson in all this. So the poem here I wrote is called Procession. The other part of procession is obviously, the other meaning of the word procession is obviously a funeral procession. Which honestly I didn't think of until near the completion of all of these poems. I had, the picture for the book is a picture my grandmother actually took. I have pictures my grandmother took, she's long passed, for this collection, and it's actually of an Easter procession back in the day. She was a very, very Catholic person, and she loved the Easter procession. And she took this grainy picture from the 30s. It's beautiful. But when I looked at it and saw those, I'm sorry, I don't know what they're called. Those stations of the cross, that's what they're called. For me, if you ever look up what's called an eagle staff. So in my tradition, I practice traditional spirituality and have for most of my life. An eagle staff is something elders carry when they walk into a place. And it holds the eagle feathers of their it's a very long, it's a sign of wisdom, knowledge, accumulation of honor. So when I saw this picture of the Stations of the Cross from my grandmother, I saw eagle staffs because that's my point of reference. But really it's something very different. But it's also not. But it also is. But it's also not. So those are where I am right now with my work and trying to really articulate this lovely experience we call life. So one more poem, Procession. You are only here to honor your ancestors and prepare for your children. More inclusive version. You are only here to learn from those who came before and make space for those who come after. Those who came before, ancestors, those who come after, children. You are at once burdened by responsibility and made free of it. What they did, what they will do, all we do. Maybe responsibility is the wrong word. Perhaps honor, learn, prepare, make space, before, after. You inherit and you pass on. Only going forward, no. It's earth that moves, and only in a circle. Sun and moon, time, stay in place. Sun, moon, we stay in place. There should be a we in there. Maybe moving is the wrong word. We are at once. Yeah. We are only at once, belong and are belong to, grounded and spirit. What you were before, children, what you will be after, ancestors. You are only and all. And I totally screwed up there, and I'm glad I did because humility. Thank you for listening to my poetry this week.
Thank you so much for this, Katherena. It's been wonderful. Thank you. This journey from your autobiographical source of writing to these last poems that I see as also coming from your tradition, but focusing more on the planet, the land we all come from, and this awareness that we are only passing by and we need to take care of the land and all those who we are lucky to live with, be them people, ancestors who live in the spirit inside us, and also all those who we don't know, right? Beings and non-beings. So thank you so much. I'd like to open the floor for questions. We didn't have the time yesterday, but please feel free, dear students, dear colleagues, just raise your hands, address the author. We are very fortunate to having you here.
Awesome. Oh, they're going to make you talk in the microphone. I also want to always say I love questions and I am very open to answering questions, so please don't be shy.
Okay, so in your novel, The Break, is there a specific reason why only Luisa and Flora, I think, their chapters are written, are narrated in the first person and the other ones are in third person? Is there a specific reason? I was curious about that.
No, I love that question. And there is. And like I said yesterday, I tend to write in first person first. I said it today too. And then I tend to shift and edit into a third person for the most part. When I wrote The Break, I think everyone was, except for Tommy, because he came last, everyone originally was an I. And when you put a whole bunch of different voices together like that, it can get very confusing really, really quickly. So I shifted it to third. And when you shift to third, you get such a different vantage point because you're not stuck in someone's head anymore. You can see different things. You can play with unreliable narrator, which is my favorite thing to do because everyone lies, right? So that's what I did, and also conveniently for a polyphonic novel, you can say names all the time. So I'm not saying an I, I'm saying Stella or Paul or whatever. So it's less confusing. But with Lou and Flora, because so much of their action was interior, I felt like I needed to keep them inside. Like, especially for Lou, who is arguably the protagonist of the novel, though you could also argue there's no protagonist, but she, so much is going on inside, but outside, she's kind of like a wall, you know, she's just doing and being. So I needed to stay inside her head to know how much she was struggling. And then with Flora, because everything happens to her in spirit, and she actually, you know, spoiler alert, she passes at the end of her chapter. So I couldn't do that outside of her because all the action was literally happening in her heart. So that's why I kept it there. And they also become, those two become such a grounding force in the novel because Lou is the one taking care of everyone. And then Flora is, of course, the matriarch. So she's, you know, she is the ground that everyone else gets to grow from. So, yeah, thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so I think one of the things that we studied in class that the students were most interested in, or maybe most puzzled by, was the notion of care, right? So we were talking yesterday about how you have such a diverse background in your own family, like that is so different from what we usually have in Spain, or at least here. And also on the other side of my question, I'm very puzzled by Stella and how she's not understood by her husband because he just doesn't share that notion of care, maybe. So I just wanted to ask you about all of this. How is care interpreted by different people with diverse backgrounds, with different, notions of maybe relationality, you know?
Yeah, thank you. It is true, there's a lot of diversity and in my world and in my community. And yeah, I've never thought of that. Again, it's one of those things where that's your worldview and what you live through, and we never think about all of the elements that how we are different from other people. Because I think with Stella and her husband, there's such a break in between how they understand the world from their cultures, you know. And it's no fault of Jeff, and I don't want to, you know, he was. Even though I think Stella interprets it in her own way, I don't think Jeff was doing anything wrong, but he just didn't understand what she was coming from. And all of those things that Stella experienced subsequently through her spiral of vicarious trauma, he doesn't know all of that stuff, or at least he doesn't know how to feel it, or he just knows the facts of that. So for him, he has no concept of how you're supposed to be doing this, because I think that's often what happens in mainstream cultures, European cultures, Western cultures, is this such a focus on the individual and the individual family, and if that, but it's really just your own success and your own survival, as opposed to in indigenous cultures, and the more traditional they are, there's a wide scope of many indigenous cultures. There's 300 in Canada, by the way. But from my indigenous cultures, Michif and Anishinaabe, there is such a focus on everybody. You know, your family is the least of your extension. It's for the good of everybody. You know, First Nations communities are structured to live communally. You know, there's a chief and council, and they actually are tasked with taking care of everyone. You know, from housing to education to basic everything, it's something that's seen as communal. When they get cash settlements for all the many things that were taken away, it goes back to everybody. You know, it's this idea that this extension is very basic, that everyone should benefit. So for Stella, she's kind of going through both of those worlds, not really understanding all of, like, why she's struggling with this, but her family taught her to look after everybody. And then he's saying, you know, look after yourself. And again, it's similar to my process that I always talk about, like, I can't just look after myself, but you also have to look after yourself, right? I think Stella goes through a very, like, I wrote that years ago. So again, it's probably my own struggle with trying to figure out, like, how do I take care of myself and take care of everyone else too? You know, that's not an Indigenous specific thing in any way, but yeah. So that's interesting. I was thinking of care. Because when you started saying care, I thought, because there's also reference to care in the book with in care, because kids are in care, and that's something when kids are involved in the foster care system. That's what it's called. It's called in care, which ironically is most of the time the exact opposite of care. So that's another play on that. So yeah, thank you.